Good evening to all of you, and I'm so glad that you are able to join this evening on the third day of our retreat on Mary Magdalene. We have been looking at the life of Mary Magdalene before she met Jesus and while she was with Jesus, and even after the lifetime of Jesus. We have looked at the gender sexuality nuances involved in the life of Mary Magdalene. It always has surprised me why the sin of any woman is immediately connected to a sexual sin. It is so strange that Mary Magdalene, a woman of her caliber, was um, ill treated in the history of biblical interpretation as a woman of bad character, while she was a woman who lived her life after Jesus' death as an ascetic. So, today in the retreat, I would like to help us to journey through the life of Mary Magdalene from the time of resurrection to the post resurrection period, where she evolved as an ascetic mystic, and the historical documents and the evidences that support that. As we look at the life of Mary Magdalene, you would have seen many glamorous pictures and art portrayals of Mary Magdalene. I would like us to imagine her journey from a, a sinner woman, a penitent sinner, to a saint. How did this woman by name Mary Magdalene journey from being labeled as a sinner woman to a saint? The idea of Mary Magdalene as a great sinner, as it was prevalent in early times, from early centuries till recent times, had made or led us to celebrate her life as a great penitent, or the intensity of her sin is always highlighted to show the salvation that Jesus could offer. This sculpture by Donatello in 15th century is a very, very special one for our understanding of Mary Magdalene. Let me see whether I have the full picture here. Oh, yes. So you see this sculpture, it's a wooden sculpture by Donatello during Italian Renaissance, which is in Florence today, uh, which which is so different from all other artistic portrayals of Mary Magdalene. Now, I invite you to look at this wooden portrayal of Mary Magdalene. And what do you see? What is so familiar about Mary Magdalene that you could see in this um, wooden portrayal or wooden sculpture? What do you identify in this? You can unmute yourself and share with us. We are a small group today, so it would be good for us to get into more engaging conversation. What does this sculpture remind us of what we know, whether it is a misinterpretation or the right interpretation, or something that reminds us about Mary Magdalene?
Well, it looks like her hands are folded, like she's praying, like she's.
Okay, yeah. Her palms are joining, but did you notice something that it is not touching each other?
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice that? Actually, it's from a different angle. If we look at, we can find this image from different angles online, and if you see this, palms are not joined. Something to note. Uh, Does that tell you anything? Joined hands and just hands that are struggling, or is it something the frailty of her shown in that? I'm just wondering. Yes. What could be? Do you see the hair? Her hair.
It's messy.
It's messy. Is there a merging of her hair with her clothes,
Yeah.
or is hair kind of covering her? Actually, if we look at her face, it shows that she's very malnourished.
Mm.
This may be from the historical factor that she lived in a cave for 30 years in France, during which time she spent most of her time in fasting and prayer.
She seems very submissive too, like she's kind of pulled inside herself.
Okay, she looks more submissive. Okay. Does that indicate her submissive spirituality?
Or has she just pulled away a little bit from life because of her experience?
Yes. Yeah. We will, does anyone else love to say anything? Otherwise, we'll be coming back to this wooden sculpture later. The journey of Mary Magdalene from being labeled as a sinner or a penitent sinner to being declared as a saint has been centuries long, about 14 centuries long. So today, if we look at any of the art forms or movies or anything similar to that, we will find the same projection of Mary Magdalene as a woman who was very sexually available to people. But by the time she was declared as a saint, the damage has been the damage done was huge. It was in 1969, July 22nd, she was declared as a saint by the Catholic Pope Paul VI. And in 2016, very recently, in the last decade, Pope Francis declared a feast day on 22nd of July, which is observed by Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Anglican, and Lutheran churches. During which time there was a kind of declaration from the Pope Vatican. The declaration was made by Cardinal Ravasi. He said that Mary Magdalene's reputation was sullied by her depiction in art over the centuries. So the art has done a much damaging thing than the interpretation. But certainly the art forms are a way to say how the biblical character was interpreted by the church leaders. So he has said this: art history made her become a prostitute, which is something that is not present in the Gospels, he said, adding that she also has been portrayed as Jesus' wife, which are not in the Gospels. It is important to find the real face of Mary Magdalene, who is a woman who represents the importance of the female aspect on the side of Christ. Now, I think we are a group of more enlightened people who are willing to look at Mary Magdalene from a different perspective.
Do you
Yeah.
think that she was depicted as a prostitute to take away her power because women weren't really perceived to have power back then?
yeah, that question is actually very, very important to understand that. But I mean, but what we miss is relating Jesus with her in the whole dynamics of power. For instance, if we term her as a prostitute, how would we look at Jesus who had allowed her to travel with him? But in
That's
the history of interpretation, that question emerged for a very serious discussion in the last century when after the Gnostic gospel, she was termed as Jesus' wife. Then the whole talk about her power relating whether she was sexually serving Jesus. So that is where the real question about power takes multiple nuances.
Mhm.
Now, if we simply take the question of power as was she termed a prostitute in order to make her subservient to Paul or other male disciples? The Gnostic Gospels, the other Gospels which we have discovered in 20th century, tell us that there have been a power dynamic or power play or power politics involved among the disciples. If you remember the writings from Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip, that there has been discussions among the disciples to talk about whether whether Mary was specially loved by Jesus to be given or entrusted with special revelations. So the power question is very, very important in understanding Mary Magdalene. That's why I have raised this question in the next slide. Mary Magdalene, the apostle to the apostles, the first woman mystic ascetic. I have left one line. I hope it comes in another slide. Or is she the founder of Christianity? There is a lot of discussion going on about her role in the early Christian church formation. She has been very highly instrumental in the formation of the church. For the same reason, she was persecuted and kind of sent, kind of banished to uh, France. So she had to escape from Palestine because of her active involvement. We will come to that a little later, but we can also come back to this question a little later. What we will do to start with is to see how Mary Magdalene has received this title as the apostle to the apostles. Let's look at that from John's Gospel. Actually, Mary Magdalene appears in all the four Gospels, and it is in John's Gospel that we see only her as the witness to Jesus' resurrection. In the other Gospels, there were like a few women went to the tomb. A couple of them were named along with Mary Magdalene. But in John's Gospel, we see, and also the fact that all the four Gospels mention Mary Magdalene is a kind of four times adding evidence to the fact that she was the first witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, in the first two verses, we see that while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and she saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she saw that the stone was removed and she comes running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. And she says her impression about the stone being removed is they have taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they have put it. So who is this they? So they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. So uh, this could indicate the Roman soldiers or the people who wanted to have a closer kind of connection with Jesus. or even some of the disciples could have done that. And when Peter and the other disciple go to the tomb to kind of confirm what Mary Magdalene told them, they found that his body was not there, and the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head was lying in its place. So this is the first picture of the resurrection of Jesus. They don't find him. They initially find that the stone had been removed. Then they don't find his body. And this passage very clearly tells us that Mary Magdalene became the apostle to the apostles. Apostle, the word refers to the one who is sent. Now, Mary Magdalene has become the first apostle, the one who is sent to tell this news to the other disciples. This is followed by a very special revelation of the risen Jesus to Mary Magdalene that we see in the verses below in chapter 20, where the disciples, she came along with the disciples, they went back, but she stood there crying, and she sees two angels. And when she saw the angels, the angels asked her why she was crying. And she says that they have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put her. So she has this reference to the people whom she has in mind. It could be the Roman soldiers or some of the disciples, but somebody who could be easily removing Jesus' body from there. And when actually Jesus appears to her, she's not realizing, or she's not identifying Jesus. So she thought of him as a gardener. Okay. So in this passage, when Jesus calls her by name, she realizes that it is Jesus. Now, this particular verse where we see that she doesn't recognize the risen Jesus. And secondly, in verse 17, it is said about Jesus, as Jesus clearly saying, do not touch him, because he has not gone to the Father. What is our understanding of these two verses? What do we understand about these two verses? Why did she not recognize Jesus? And Jesus says not to touch him. So these two aspects of the resurrection. How do you like to understand that?
Well, do you think that she didn't see him because she wasn't thinking that that is what had happened? So when she looked, she just saw who she thought she would see, which would be a gardener or a guard or something, because she was distraught and thought Jesus was gone.
Yes. The possibility is that they won't have expected, or she or other disciples wouldn't have expected expected that Jesus would be risen. So it is something beyond their imagination or expectation. So they just couldn't believe it, and they were not prepared to believe it. And why do you think Jesus said, or Jesus asked her to not touch him? And it is connected to him ascending to God the Father, or God.
Do you think he wasn't corporeal anymore? That he had lost his body in essence, and he wouldn't be able to regain physical form until he'd been up to see God?
Okay. So something about ascension, something about ascension is connected to his non-physical body or the spiritual body and his ascension, and a kind of distancing from others. So that becomes a kind of beginning of his resurrected life, where the differentiation of him being physical at this point is highlighted. So if I would invite you to imagine yourself as Mary Magdalene at this point in this garden, how would your responses be?
Well, if she'd been listening the whole time to what Jesus was saying,
Mhm.
wouldn't it then be that suddenly the realization is there that what he had said was going to happen was actually happening?
Mhm. So if you put yourself in this position, in that where Mary Magdalene is, how would you see that? I mean, first of all, we looked at the kind of not expecting this happening. There is very, very less chance for people to expect that Jesus would be resurrected. And at this point, John's gospel very clearly says that they were not knowing that Jesus is already resurrected.
Well, I think she would still be sad
Mhm.
because of her loss, but I think then she would also be hopeful and know that there was more to life than just life. There was life after.
Okay. Yes. So she was sad, but she was also hopeful about the possibilities of how things would unfold. Yeah, I think at this point I would also think the same. And as we move on to, I want you to look at some of I know I'm just skipping a few things to show you how the present research, historical research on Mary Magdalene's life after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and how that kind of tells us, or how it expands the picture of Mary Magdalene in the scholarship as well as in the minds of people. So, when we try to understand Mary Magdalene, especially in the post resurrection period, two significant sites of pilgrimage were witness to this claim that there was a clear connection between Mary Magdalene and Provence, place in south of France. That is the first one is the Basilica of Saint Mary Magdalene. Second one is called La Sainte Baume. It's a mountain cave in southern France. I try to get the images. You can always find that online. Maybe you can add to your travel plans. This is the Basilica of Saint Mary Magdalene, and it is one I could find. And this is the chapel and the cave. This is about 10 miles away from the cathedral in southern France. So this is the chapel. These two places have a lot of historical evidences to tell us about her life after the resurrection. And let's look at them. Yeah, and this is little gory for evening, right? This is the relic of Mary Magdalene's skull and golden reliquary in the Cathedral of Mary Magdalene. Now, let's look at what the tradition says. At this point, I'm only sharing a tradition, a prominent tradition, and the scholarly research varies on the number of people involved and whether this is the exact names as mentioned, but we can have a brief discussion on that. I will read for you. After the execution of Saint James in Jerusalem, son of Zebedee and Mary Salome, Mary Magdalene, Martha, okay, here, whether it is his sister, we can come back to that. Martha and brother Lazarus were persecuted by the Jews of Jerusalem and imprisoned. The Jews were afraid of the crowd if they were to execute the prisoners, so they towed them off the shores of Palestine in a boat without sails or oars or supplies and abandoned them to the open sea. Others in the boat included Mary, mother of James, and the sister of the Virgin Mary, Mary Salome, mother of the apostles James and John, Maximin, one of the 72 disciples of Christ, Sidonius, the blind man who was miraculously healed by Jesus. I was happy to find this name because we recently had a preaching on this passage. So, and Marcel, Martha's servant, and Sarah, maid of the two Marys. So, after narrowly escaping death during a storm at sea, the boat finally came to shore on the coast of Gaul in a town now called Saintes Maries de la Mar in France. Now, we have excavation evidences for the boat. I mean, that's very interesting. If you may find it in YouTube, or even some of the web pages have the excavation details of the boat in which they supposed to have traveled. So this is a kind of information. Here we have a couple of questions emerging. Does that mean Mary Magdalene is Mary of Bethany? Because Martha and brother Lazarus are mentioned in this dominant French tradition. So the question emerges whether Mary Magdalene was same as Mary of Bethany. Now, this again goes back and forth in the interpretation exercise to see how you would interpret Mary Magdalene. Now we will see the next slide. Yeah, and this is, I found this. It's a portrayal of Mary preaching in France, preaching in the place called Marseille. I hope I'm pronouncing it correct. So this I found as a very beautiful picture of where Mary is preaching. I think it is a Dominican tradition where she looks more like a Dominican kind of woman, or like the kind of course it's also Renaissance period. So projecting her as a very wise, very noble woman standing there to preach to the French people. So that is that, I mean, I have chosen this to tell us that she went to France and she preached, and the cave and the cathedral and the relic, her tomb, all that help us to believe that she played a major role of spreading Christianity in Europe. And so this picture I personally have found very, very attractive, because it is not a portrayal of her as a very beautiful, glamorous kind of personality, but then a very, very kind of, I look at it as an aristocratic kind of noble woman who was showing up as the authentic witness to Jesus' life. Yeah. Now, after reaching this place, I'm jumping to her last years. She had been living in a cave. If you look at this picture, which I showed you earlier, this chapel is kind of built within the cave. It's as part of the cave. So that is called as La Sainte Baume. And if she had started her ascetic life in this cave in supposedly 47 CE, and if she had remained there for 30 years of her life in contemplation, prayer, and penance, and also the tradition tells us that she has been lifted up by the angels 7 times each day. And she had only the heavenly nourishment, but physically she was fasting and praying. And some traditions say that she just didn't eat anything for 30 years. And her survival or existence, sustenance were predominantly by the belief that she was catered to by the angels. And the kind of uh, the idea of the chapel shows that it was built in memory of Mary Magdalene being raised by angels. So she was um, nourished in a divine way by the angels. So I was trying just to tell you very briefly, because these need so many um, evidences that need to be attached, but this you can consider as a as the prominent or as the most believed the tradition of Mary Magdalene after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, I wanted you to see this relic, which is in the Cathedral of Mary Magdalene in the southern France. And this is the cave, which is 10 miles away from the cathedral. The relic is um, in this particular cathedral. So it helps us to look at the tradition, which reveals our identity as totally different from what we generally hear about Mary Magdalene. Now, if you look at Mary Magdalene from what I have just shared, what are the thoughts that come to your mind? If you want to rewrite the story of Mary Magdalene, how would you tell, or how would you retell the story of Mary Magdalene? I
Well,
mean,
do you think that they made her, that they said that she was eating only food offered by the angels
yeah.
to more as a metaphor, that they were
Uh,
trying to state that she should be held in high regard?
yes, that is certainly the possibility. Uh, but there are documents which state that she lived without eating, which for us to believe like it could be like it's a bit
Cool.
exaggerated picture of Mary Magdalene. But the people who lived during her time have kind of recorded that she lived. So she lived without food. So we can say that the kind of tradition or the legends that talked about Mary Magdalene believed that she was treated by the angels to continue her excellence. Yeah. Now, from her life in this cave, the image of her is kind of repainted as an ascetic woman. And she is termed as a mystic, probably, or by all possibilities, the first woman mystic because of her revelations which she had received from Jesus Christ after the resurrection. So the kind of revelation she had indicate that she was a mystic person who claimed to have had the supernatural revelations of Jesus Christ. So my research and my book, I'm trying to focus on Mary Magdalene or kind of repaint her story as a woman mystic ascetic, and certainly that looks at all different kinds of interpretation from the lens of gender sexuality. So I would also I'm very interested in the question someone raised in the beginning regarding the power, because how power plays a kind of role in perceiving historical realities from the lens of gender sexuality nexus. Maybe that could also be very fascinating. So I'm fascinated by the life of Mary Magdalene, mainly to see her as a very very vulnerable woman who was very open, or at least who was, I mean, we can say who was subjected to such ill treatment or the misinterpretations in the later times. It also helps me to ask the same questions in the first century when she was preaching in Palestine before she was persecuted. Was she treated as a woman of no value? Or how is her preaching accepted by people if she was treated as a woman of no value or low value? These are the questions that I basically raise, and I find them. I mean, trying to answer them is found to be more fascinating.
If she were really of no value, would she have been enough of a threat to be forced out of Palestine?
That's a very valid question. Yeah. Why would she become a woman of threat to the people of authorities who wanted to do away with Christianity or Christian teachings? Or if she was just an ordinary woman, but her preachings and sermons, as we see in the Gospel of Mary or Gospel of Philip or any other Gnostic literature, that is the literature discovered in 20th century, she was a very powerful woman of words, sermons, revelations.
She must have made somebody nervous. You know what I mean? Otherwise, she was just some woman standing on the corner.
That's a high probability, yes. Yeah.
Well, the fact that she spoke out and she preached was probably to some people just unheard of.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
I would rewrite her story as equal to any of the 12 disciples. I think she was a disciple.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting. I mean, I'm glad the church came out and tried to change how they ruined her image in the, what was it, 1969 or the 2016.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they blame it on art history. I think art history was reflecting what the church was saying about her.
I agree.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah.
And
I don't think she was a prostitute. I don't think none of that.
Well, they say throughout history, even when someone wants to demonize someone, the accusation can always go towards being a pedophile or something that's so horrendous that everybody will ostracize that person. And I think this is another example of that, by making her a whore, that they were demonizing her.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, the only roles for women were really you were a saint or you were a whore. And that's what they did in the Bible. There's the Virgin Mary and there's Mary Magdalene. And there's not a lot of room for anybody in between. And you still kind of see that for women nowadays. I mean, nowhere near as bad.
Yeah, and I have I have tried to raise this question uh, uh, regarding the identity of Mary Magdalene. See, she was termed a sexually immoral woman or a prostitute from the passage where it says, "A sinful woman came to meet Jesus." And where does that idea come from that it could only be sexual? There could
Well,
be.
they
Why
did
didn't
it.
they say that she stole something? She was a thief, or she was that, or she was this. But how immediately this any sin related to any sinner woman is a sexual sin, and we see many sinner men in the New Testament, and no one, even the explicit ones, are not termed as a sexually immoral man, and that always has been like.
Well,
bothering
I
me.
think Corin said, I mean, to her point, it was like, even in today's society, when the Asians first started coming over, they did the same thing to the Asian women.
Uh-huh.
They were so beautiful, and I think they wanted to take their power away. And so they just resigned them to just being these sexual beings. And that even that myth carries forward to today. So the labels really can have an effect.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you have Mary, the mother of God, who had no sex at all. Like, it's like one extreme to the other. I mean, these people were obsessed with sex.
It is like either you need to be a virgin or a mother, or you are a prostitute. There is nothing in between. Either you all have to be a virgin or a prostitute. Why not the sexuality of women be appropriated in the right manner? As
Yeah.
why women are treated either as
Animal type of thing, carrying water and doing stuff like that.
Yeah. So that is something uh, that we really need to reconsider. Yeah.
I think something really touching about her is that she was at the tomb. She's the one who went
Mm-hmm.
the next day. And she was also at the foot of the cross. I mean, it was the women who were there in his darkest hour. The male disciples were not there. And I just think that's really touching. It took a lot of courage to be with him at the cross, and it took a lot of courage to
Yes.
go to get his body. I mean, he was a traitor. So she was very brave, and I just find that touching.
Yes. Yeah. It is very moving when we really sit with readings on Mary Magdalene. It's very moving, and it inspires and motivates us to see how we as women could be.
But Chitra, how do we get the word out? Because until you did this little retreat, I had never heard the story of Mary Magdalene being this upright, really good person. And so I think we need to have some kind of rally.
Yes. Yes, we need to do that. I mean, in my earlier days of research, I mean, this had started actually, my fascination about Mary Magdalene started in 2006. So for the last 18 years, I've been thinking of her. Initially, I used to feel like, I used to feel so angry, so frustrated and desperate about how come this woman being so badly misinterpreted. And then later on in the journey, I found that there is something special about knowing this, which is not known to many. Maybe I'll call all of you for this. Come and talk about that. I would definitely look at that. And
But sometimes don't you think when they make somebody a martyr like this, that kind of subverts what they really want to do, and it actually increases their power? Because she was always remembered, she was always mentioned, her name is known. And now it's just getting it back to what it needs to be. And maybe with a lot of people, I'm not as learned. They might already know, but that's it's interesting that she's dominant in history.
Mhm.